Hi, today we're going to talk about Herman Melville, specifically his short story, Bartleby the Scrivener. But before we delve into that story, just a little bit of background on Melville. We're still in America, and certainly in the New England states. Melville was born and lived most of his life in New York. And even though he wasn't part of the transcendental community per se, he certainly knew Emerson and Thoreau, but he was most influenced by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who we're not reading for this course, but you might recognize Hawthorne's name from the Scarlet Letter. And after Melville read the Scarlet Letter, he felt like he wanted to do something different with his writing. Up until this point in Melville's life, he was a successful writer of kind of adventure fiction, if you will. He was a merchant marine for a period of time, so he knew a lot about being on the water, and wrote kind of rousing stories about sailors and the like. But after the Scarlet Letter, he decided that he wanted to tap more into symbolic works. And in 1851, as some of you may know, he published Moby Dick, which is generally regarded today as one of the greatest American novels. But in Melville's time, it fell pretty much flat. Nobody quite knew what to do with the great white whale. I mentioned that for our conversation for today because I think it's helpful for two reasons. One, if you know anything about Moby Dick, it is a story about a captain who is struck with monomania, or a relentless drive and obsession to do one thing. In a little bit different regards, but certainly somebody with a single-track mind would be Bartleby, and Bartleby the Scrivener, because he certainly will not be moved from his one purpose in life. The question for us is, what is it exactly that Bartleby is obsessed with? Other than preferring not to do something. And then, of course, the second thing is, I think it's kind of difficult to read Bartleby the Scrivener just as a straightforward, literal story about a clerk who decides that he doesn't want to work anymore. It might be helpful to think about some of these things symbolically. Certainly, two characters that are worth looking at symbolically would be, again, Bartleby. And some critics have argued that Bartleby really is an enlightened sage, that he has realized something about life and the nature of work that no one around him understands. And so, like many sages, he is unable to completely communicate what it is that he believes about life, and spends the most of his days in quiet meditation, only responding to people when they choose to disturb him or disturb his work area. And there's a couple other ways that we can look at Bartleby as well. One way certainly is to just look at him as someone who is clinically depressed. But I would argue that that's probably a late 20th century, early 21st century way. And sometimes I think it's a little bit hazardous to go back and diagnose characters from other parts of history, but certainly he bears a lot of the hallmarks of someone who is depressed. And so there's a couple other things we'll look at as we go along as well. Another thing I want you to think about is the narrator. We have a first-person narrator who is Bartleby's boss for the vast majority of this story. We're never given the narrator's name. He just refers to himself as I, which is uncommon for a first-person narrator. But what exactly is the narrator symbolic of? If we look at Bartleby as symbolic of a larger ideal, then maybe it might be helpful to think about the narrator as well. One idea is that the narrator is actually that Bartleby, is kind of a portion of the narrator's psyche. It is a part of him that perhaps he would like to be other than someone who is just a sheep-like cog in the machine of capitalism. And I think that's where we should continue with our conversation. In many ways, this story seems to be a story about capitalism. Mid-part of the 19th century, certainly people are being more and more driven by economies, figuring out ways to make money. And hopefully you noticed right beneath the title of Bartleby the Scrivener, it says it's a story of Wall Street. And certainly not Wall Street as we imagine it in the 21st century, almost completely being driven by the stock market. A lot of times when we think of Wall Street, we think of traders on the floor of the stock market. But certainly even in the mid part of the 19th century, this is a hub of capitalist activity. And for our case, our narrator is an attorney of some sort, and he needs lots of people to write and make copies of legal documents, and that's where Bartleby comes in. He is a scribe or a scrivener employed to make multiple copies of documents. Now, for my money anyway, this short story begins in a rather humorous way. Melville presents us with three clerks who precede Bartleby, and we have some somewhat ludicrous nicknames that they have given one another. We have Turkey, who is a rather genial or calm, great employee in the morning, and then afternoon something happens to him and he becomes surly and irate and grumpy. And then on the flip side of Turkey, we have Nippers. And Nippers is just the opposite. He is not a morning person. He is surly, and by the noon he begins to calm down, and he's the calming force in the office in the afternoon. And then we have Ginger Nut. I'm sorry, I was going to say Ginger Snap. Ginger Nut, who is a mere lad, a young man. He's sort of the errand boy for the office, if you will. And he goes and buys sweets for everyone, including Bartleby, when he begins to work there. And so Melville, I would argue, sets us off with some types, right? Maybe some stereotypes, the types of people that we might encounter in an office space. And then I think that prepares us in some ways to look at Bartleby as a type when he finally arrives. One of the most mysterious things about Bartleby, of course, is that the narrator, not until the very end of the story does he give us any sort of idea about what kind of work he did before. But the narrator's not sure where he comes from. He doesn't appear to have any family. He doesn't appear to have any friends. He has nothing outside of the workplace. So, if you were going to read this story perhaps as a critique of capitalism, I think there are many things within the story that supports that. The idea that work is all that these poor American workers have, right? There's really no life, no sense of family or friends outside of the office place. And so one way you could look at the story then is when Bartleby decides not to work anymore, it may be kind of his attempt at removing himself from the capitalist structure. Now, some of you may be working adults. If you are more traditional students, if you have a job, most of us can't fathom operating like this in the workplace, especially if you are someone who is a supervisor, who has people working for you. A lot of people react to this story sometimes almost in an angry way. We side with Turkey because when the narrator asks Turkey, "What should I do with this guy?" He's like, "Well, you want me to pummel him? You want me to blacken his eyes?" All the other employees seem to agree that he should be fired or punished in some way. But again, I would encourage you maybe to think about the story more symbolically. Yes, we all agree that this would be the world's worst employee, but is there something more significant going on? I'm going to kind of skip past the first couple of pages where we meet Turkey and Nippers and Ginger Nut. Again, I think that adds some humor and also sort of sets us up for maybe looking at these characters as types. But let's look on page 1159, where Bartleby first arrives on the scene. And we're told right there at the top of the page, at first Bartleby did an extraordinary quantity of writing. I think that Melville has him be an industrious employee here at the beginning to kind of rule out the idea that Bartleby is somehow lazy or incompetent, unable to do the work. He clearly can do the work that is asked of him when he first comes to the office. Now, the maddening thing for the narrator and for Turkey and for Nippers and for a lot of readers is we don't really get any sense of why, because it happens quickly. Midway through that same page, it says, "In this very attitude did I sit when I called to him, rapidly stating what it was I wanted him to do, namely to examine a small paper with me. Imagine my surprise, nay, my consternation, when without moving from his privacy, Bartleby in a singular, mild, firm voice replied, 'I would prefer not to.'" Now, most of us can imagine, maybe we can even think of a time when we've done this, when a supervisor or a teacher asks us to do something, or maybe even a parent. I think everybody has the opportunity to say once, twice, maybe a couple of times, I would prefer not to do that. But where the sticking point comes with Bartleby is from this moment on in the story, everything the narrator asks him to do, he responds with some variation of, "I would prefer not to." In some ways, the story becomes a theater of the absurd, right? That we just keep getting piled on because it becomes kind of ridiculous, because the narrator decides, okay, I got to fire this guy, right? There's no way this insubordination can stand. I'm not going to pay somebody for doing nothing. And yet, it's exactly what he does. It turns out, we find out a couple pages later, that Bartleby never really eats. All he eats are these sweets that Ginger brings. And then at one point, the narrator finds a little bit of cheese, perhaps, that he's got squirreled away in his desk. But it doesn't seem, he never leaves the office during the day. And then, lo and behold, on a Sunday morning, on page 1164, the narrator is passing by his office on a Sunday morning, and he decides to go into the office and realizes that Bartleby is there. He discovers that Bartleby is actually living in the office. He literally never leaves. Again, if you want to think about some kind of conflicting tensions that I think this suggests, is again the idea perhaps that Melville is criticizing capitalism, right? That it is a machine from which workers cannot escape, and in a very kind of heightened way it has sucked Bartleby into it. The workplace has become his entire life, his entire existence. And yet the significant thing for Bartleby is that he has chosen to check out of that system without ever actually leaving it. We have talked about Thoreau a couple weeks ago. I didn't have you read Civil Disobedience, but if you think about that idea of civil disobedience, right, resisting government structures, resisting laws, but doing it in a non-violent way. It's one thing that hopefully you notice about Bartleby is he never raises his voice, he never gets angry. He just simply says, I prefer not to. I'm going to be here physically, but I'm going to check out of this rat race. And so I think that's one of the things, on one hand, where it seems absurd and kind of funny that this employee refuses to work and he's living in the office and he's driving the narrator mad because the narrator's trying to think of all sorts of things. I'm gonna pay him, double, triple whatever his wages would be for the next couple of months, and tell him that I'll write him a good letter of recommendation. At one point in the story, even says, "Hey, come live with me, right? Just get out of the office and let me figure out what to do with you." And yet, Bartleby is an immovable force. He will not be forced to do something that he prefers not to do. Some other interesting things I think that Melville does on 1167. So in one ways I think he's suggesting that Bartleby's attitude, even though he seems to be very singular and isolated, that this sort of civil disobedience could catch on right? That other people could be influenced by this way. And I'm going to read a rather long passage there, most of the page on 1167, when the narrator starts talking about how that phrase, "I'd prefer not to," in his mind begins to infect the office, I might say influence the office. "Mr. Nippers," said I, "I'd prefer you would withdraw for the present." Somehow of late I had gotten into the way of involuntarily using this word "prefer" upon all sorts of not exactly suitable occasions, and I trembled to think that my contact with the scrivener had already and seriously affected me in a mental way. And what further and deeper aberration might it not yet produce? This apprehension had not been without efficiency in determining me to summary measures. As Nippers, looking very sour and sulky, was departing, Turkey blandly and deferentially approached. "With submission, sir," said he. "Yesterday I was thinking about Bartleby here, and I think that if he would but prefer to take a quart of good ale every day, it would do much towards mending him, and enabling him to assist in examining his papers." "So you've got the word too," said I, slightly excited. "With submission? What word, sir?" asked Turkey, respectfully crowding himself into the contracted space behind the screen, and by so doing, making me jostle the scrivener. "What word, sir?" "I would prefer to be left alone here," said Bartleby, as if offended at being mobbed in his privacy. "That's the word, Turkey," said I. "That's it." "Oh, prefer. Oh, yes, queer word. I never use it myself. But, sir, as I was saying, if he would but prefer—" "Turkey," interrupted I, "you will please withdraw." "Oh, certainly, sir, if you would prefer that I should." As he opened the folding room door to retire, Nippers at his desk caught a glimpse of me and asked whether I would prefer to have a certain paper copied on blue paper or white. He did not in the least roguishly accent the word "prefer." It was plain that it was involuntarily rolled from his tongue. I thought to myself, surely I must get rid of a demented man who already has in some degree turned the tongues, if not the heads, of myself and clerks. But I thought it prudent not to break the dismission at once. So again, I think Melville is suggesting that Bartleby's attitude is beginning to infect the other people in the office to the point where everyone's consciously and unconsciously using the word "prefer," and the narrator realizes, hey, I've got to root this out or I'm going to lose the entire office and maybe something about myself, right? Because he's afraid that he's the first person that he notices using this word "prefer." And immediately after that, at the bottom of the page, Bartleby decides that not only are there activities that he prefers not to do in the office, but he's just not going to work at all. He's not going to do anything else. So we kind of reach the height of the absurdity when the narrator tries to fire him, can't, decides that he's going to take care of him himself. And some critics have argued perhaps that this narrator also symbolizes maybe American benevolence, right? Some sort of a charity that certain folks feel towards others. Maybe the narrator is a closet socialist, if you will, because he really feels like deep down in his heart and through his actions that Bartleby should be taken care of. So we have this industrious lawyer who is our narrator, who runs his own business. He hires employees. He's got an office on Wall Street, and yet he's allowing Bartleby to kind of shape the way he's thinking. And so maybe perhaps the narrator's thinking, okay, maybe not everybody has to be part of this production, part of this capitalist machine, and that maybe I should just take care of Bartleby. Maybe he's someone who needs to be taken care of, which again some people might argue is perhaps a kind of a endorsement of a socialist approach to community living. So we get to the point, though, however, the narrator towards the end says, I can't get rid of this guy, so I'm going to leave. He tells Bartleby, hey, look, I'm moving the office tomorrow, moving everything out, thanks. If you need any money, I can help you with that. If you need recommendations wherever you end up, call me. But tomorrow we're all going to be gone. And that's exactly what happens. And so for a day or two, the narrator feels like he has rid himself of this problem. And then the last couple of pages of the story, then of course, people come and track down the narrator, and they're like, hey, you left behind some dude who won't work. You need to take care of this. And the narrator tries to kind of argue, and he's like, no, he's not my responsibility. And finally he's like, yes, I'll go talk to him. And of course he gets nowhere with Bartleby. He's like, hey, how about these other jobs that I could find for you? And Bartleby says, I prefer not to do that. Not a complicated man, but I prefer not to do that. I prefer not to do that. It seems to be that work is the one thing that Bartleby doesn't want. Now, if you've grown up in a capitalist society, if you value hard work as I do, this may really rub you the wrong way. But I think one of the things that Melville is trying to get us to think about is work the only reason we exist? Is Bartleby a horrible, wretched human being because he would like to exist without the daily grind? So something to ponder. So at the end of the story, of course, he gets taken away to the Tombs, which is a prison. He's not really treated so much like a prisoner. He's allowed to go places that he wants to. It almost seems like a prison for criminals, but also perhaps a place for the mentally ill in a time where that wasn't always, there weren't always distinctions made between those two things. And then the story ends, and the narrator tells us, hey, Bartleby, we get the sense, stops eating, right? Perhaps starves himself to death. And then we're told in the last couple paragraphs that indeed he is dead. And then the narrator says, I don't know exactly what he did before he came to work for me, but I heard rumors that he had been laid off, right? That the position had been cut, and he worked at the dead letter office. And so I think there's a little bit of a symbolism there. What happens to correspondence that gets lost, that is addressed to people who no longer exist, and that somehow this was meaningful work for Bartleby, perhaps, that he enjoyed being in charge of kind of the end of the line for endeavors that had gone nowhere. So kind of in conclusion, some things to think about. You can read this story literally if you'd like. And again, if you enjoy capitalism, it'll probably drive you mad to think about Bartleby as an employee. But perhaps if you think about it symbolically, excuse me, again, think about Bartleby as an enlightened sage in some ways, as a critique of capitalism, as someone who is practicing civil disobedience. And then again, even though the narrator is frustrated with Bartleby, I think we can certainly make the argument that there's something about him that he admires. So perhaps that Bartleby is a portion of the narrator's psyche. And then on the other hand, this may be kind of paradoxical, but you could look at the narrator not only as someone who admires Bartleby, but someone who is caught sheep-like in the cog of capitalism, but also then maybe perhaps a more benevolent approach, that he does show a softer side of some people within America, because he does have a benevolent aspect. He tries everything he can think of to help poor Bartleby out. And then maybe perhaps even he has a little bit of socialist leanings himself, and trying to figure out some way to help Bartleby be a productive member of society without having to work in a traditional sort of way. So I look forward to seeing what you all think about this story and Herman Melville in general. Thanks.